The date is August 28, 1963, Washington, D.C. The air is absolutely thick with anticipation. If you look at the Lincoln Memorial on this day, you're going to see a truly incredible scene. A 34-year-old preacher steps up to the microphone, but the words he's about to speak, they aren't just one man's dream. They are the voice of a nation that has been waiting centuries for true freedom.
To put this into perspective, 250,000 people. That is how many folks stood shoulder to shoulder that day. It was a crowd of just unprecedented size, waiting in the Capitol. And they weren't just there for a speech, they were waiting to hear a message that would literally define an era.
Okay, let's dive into this, because to truly grasp the gravity of this moment, we have to ask a central question. How exactly did Martin Luther King Jr. reach this stage? I mean, this wasn't some overnight phenomenon, right? To understand the dream, we really have to look back at the long, grueling struggle that birthed it.
So let's rewind exactly a century. Back in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And shortly after that, the 13th and 14th Amendments officially abolished slavery and promised equal protection under the law. Sounded like a monumental victory, right? But for the next several decades, all the way into the 1950s, brutal Jim Crow segregation laws were strictly enforced.
And this brings us to a really bitter, central irony of American history. On one hand, you had freedom on paper, constitutional amendments that sounded absolutely perfect, but on the other hand, you had freedom in reality, or, the complete lack of it. Segregation, strict voting restrictions, separate public facilities. It all meant that while America had technically ended slavery, it had utterly failed to achieve actual equality.
Right into the middle of this deeply divided world, a boy was born. January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. Martin Luther King Jr. grew up in a prominent Black Baptist family. He wasn't born a superhero. He was just a young boy raised in the church, surrounded by faith and preaching. But as he grew, he experienced the painful, everyday reality of racial discrimination firsthand, realizing very early on that society treated him entirely differently simply because of the color of his skin.
As King grew older, his intellectual curiosity really blossomed. He studied Christianity, theology, justice, and crucially, he studied the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. This led him directly to a profound philosophical framework, nonviolent resistance. He essentially asked, if you don't answer oppression and hate with violence, how do you answer it? His answer was organized, unwavering moral courage.
And this philosophy met its first massive historical test in 1955, Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks famously refuses to give up her bus seat and is arrested. In response, the Black community launches a massive, coordinated bus boycott. And who emerges as a key leader of this movement? The young pastor Martin Luther King Jr., thrust suddenly into an intense national spotlight.
But we have to remember, activism in this era was terrifying. It wasn't glamorous at all. The documented brutality was severe. We're talking frequent arrests, intense state surveillance, violence. In 1956, King's own home was bombed. Yet, even when his family's life was directly threatened, he firmly chose moral courage, demanding that his followers not retaliate with hate.
Which brings us to 1963, the Crucible of Birmingham, a city on fire.
The stakes had completely exploded during the 1963 Birmingham campaign. Peaceful demonstrations were met with shocking force, police dogs and fire hoses. King himself was thrown into a jail cell in a city that felt like it was literally burning. And it was in that cell that King wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail. He posed a question that became the intellectual foundation of the entire movement. How long should people wait for justice? He adamantly refused the advice of folks telling him to just be patient. For King, waiting meant denying basic human rights.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the broader context. When we think of the March on Washington, we almost always think only of King. But it was actually organized by brilliant strategists like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. And if you look at their core demand, it was jobs and freedom. This march was heavily focused on economic justice, not just a philosophical dream. The tension leading up to this march was just unbelievable. It's August 27th, the night before. Washington is bracing for this massive influx of humanity. Police and government officials are incredibly anxious about logistics and potential violence. And where is King? At 3:30 in the morning, he is still wide awake, nervously crossing out words and finalizing the speech that would change history.
Then, the sun rises. August 28, 1963. It was an absolutely cinematic sight. Trains and buses poured into the city. Hundreds of thousands of people converged entirely peacefully.
The streets were just filled with protest signs, religious leaders, musicians, and American flags. It was this monumental gathering of purpose and peace.
And as King finally steps up to the microphone, the symbolism is staggering. He's standing directly in front of the statue of Abraham Lincoln, exactly 100 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. King is standing right there in 1963, essentially asking the nation, has this promise actually been kept?
Let's move to and see how this builds, because it wasn't just a spontaneous rant. It was a masterfully structured argument. He started with step 1, the promissory note, stating America wrote a check of equality that essentially bounced for Black Americans. Then step 2, the urgency of now, rejecting the idea of waiting any longer. Finally, step 3, the dream, a very concrete vision of racial brotherhood.
But then, an extraordinary historical moment happens. Right mid-speech, legendary gospel singer Mahalia Jackson shouts from the crowd, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." Prompted by her voice, King steps away from his prepared text. He stops reading that manuscript he stayed up until 3:30 a.m. writing. His improvisational preacher's rhythm takes over, and he just speaks directly from the heart.
And that is the exact moment he delivers the immortal words, "I have a dream." Delivered with this quiet intensity that eventually built into a roaring crescendo, his specific vision of freedom echoed across the reflecting pool like a national prophecy.
So why did this moment become completely immortal? Well, structurally, it was a masterclass in communication. He seamlessly blended biblical imagery with core American ideals. He rooted his delivery deep in the rich tradition of the Black church, using mesmerizing repetition. He essentially took concrete, urgent political demands and merged them perfectly with immense, soaring hope. Now we have to dispel the myth that everything was magically fixed that day. The struggle absolutely did not end in 1963. The movement's immense pressure led to the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, but racism didn't just vanish. By the late 1960s, King had to shift his focus to fiercely fighting systemic poverty and economic inequality. The work was far, far from over. And tragically, his pursuit of that work cost him everything. April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. He was only 39 years old. It was just a profound, devastating loss of a leader who had literally given his entire life to the pursuit of justice.
But, as the historical record clearly shows, while the man was gone, the movement was immortal. King didn't single-handedly change America. He was the most powerful voice of a massive collective struggle made up of countless individuals. His legacy, cemented by the Nobel Peace Prize and landmark legislation, completely survived the tragedy of his death.
Bringing us full circle back to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, what we really must take away from all this is that August 28, 1963 wasn't just a moment of spontaneous inspiration or, a lovely speech. It was a mirror held up to an entire nation. It was a strict, unyielding reminder of unfulfilled promises and a direct demand for accountability. So we have to look at our world today and ask ourselves the hard question. Did America finally fulfill its promise? Or are we still walking the path toward that dream? Because this history isn't just sitting in the past, it's the very foundation of the world we're still building today.